Fat loss is achieved by losing weight while preserving as much muscle mass as possible. There are many factors that go into achieving this, but not all are equally important. So which factors are most important and which don't have much of an impact at all? The first and by far the most important factor for fat loss is calorie intake. This refers to the total number of calories consumed throughout the entire day, and more importantly, throughout the entire week. Our energy intake is the biggest modifiable factor that can influence energy balance, or the net balance when comparing energy intake versus energy expenditure. Essentially, we want to eat in a calorie deficit on average over time, meaning to eat fewer calories than you expend. Successfully adhering to a calorie deficit will result in weight loss over time. However, weight loss itself isn't necessarily the goal here. The goal here is to lose body fat. If we were to simply lose body weight, we would certainly see substantial fat loss, but we will also likely lose a decent amount of muscle mass in the process. This was seen in this research review, which looked at body composition changes with weight loss. This graph shows how much fat mass versus lean mass was lost in various different studies with different diet strategies. And in all cases, around 25% of the weight that was lost came from lean mass, while the rest came from fat mass, apart from the high protein diet, which is something we will discuss later. So as a general rule, we would expect around 1/4 of the mass lost during a calorie deficit to be lean mass and around 3/4 to be fat mass, if there is no specific effort to enhance muscle retention. Although there are other unmodifiable factors influencing how much fat-free mass loss we will see with weight loss. We generally see a greater proportion of lean mass lost in leaner individuals compared with those at a higher body fat, and females tend to see less lean mass losses compared with males. While these factors are unmodifiable, there are strategies we can implement to increase the amount of lean mass we retain during weight loss, and therefore increase the amount of fat that is lost. And this leads us onto our next priority for fat loss, which is resistance training. This has the biggest influence on the proportion of muscle versus fat we lose during weight loss. Resistance training provides an anabolic stimulus for our muscles. This gives our physiology a reason for muscle mass to be retained or even built during the weight loss process. And this will almost certainly improve the amount of lean mass we retain during weight loss and therefore increase the proportion of fat lost. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which assessed the influence of resistance training during weight loss on body composition changes. It was found that calorie restriction alone is effective for weight loss, but also results in a little bit of lean mass loss, as we would expect. However, when resistance training is implemented alongside calorie restriction, lean mass can be entirely maintained in some cases. This therefore results in a greater amount of fat loss as a proportion of the total weight lost. So how should you train to maximize muscle retention? Well, essentially you would want to train in the same way as if you were intending to build muscle mass. Here is a general overview of best practices for muscle growth training. Train the muscles you want to grow with at least 10 direct sets per week. Take each set close to failure, at least around 3 reps in reserve. Lift anywhere within the approximate 5 to 20 rep range and adjust loads accordingly. Select exercises and lift with a technique that ensures fatigue of the target muscle group is the limiter of each set. The third priority on our list is our total daily physical activity levels. For the purposes of fat loss, physical activity has the role of increasing energy expenditure. This can influence the energy balance equation to help promote a calorie deficit. While this is true, exercise doesn't seem to be quite as effective as we might think for weight loss. For example, this study explored the effects of a diet or exercise intervention on weight loss. 439 overweight or obese women were assigned to an exercise and/or diet protocol for 1 year. One group was assigned to perform 45 minutes of aerobic exercise 5 times per week. Another group received individualized nutrition counseling from a dietitian. And the third group were assigned both the exercise and diet interventions. After 1 year, all groups successfully lost weight. The exercise group lost around 2% of their initial body weight, the diet group lost around 9% body weight, and the combined exercise and diet group lost the most weight, around 11%. So while exercise appears to be effective for weight loss, it doesn't seem to be as effective as diet changes. One reason for this is likely due to the concept of energy compensation. This essentially means that as we do more exercise, we see involuntary reductions in energy expenditure via other components. And as a result, we don't expend as much additional energy as we might have predicted. This idea was established in this research review, which aimed to explore the influence of physical activity on total daily energy expenditure. Overall, the researchers found that the evidence tends to support what is known as a constrained model of energy expenditure. This essentially means that as we burn more energy via physical activity, other components are downregulated. So the net total daily energy burned follows more of a diminishing returns response as opposed to being directly additive. However, we don't quite know what exact components of energy expenditure are downregulated and to what extent, how this changes at different body fat levels, how this changes as we gain, maintain, or lose body weight, and whether this is more of an acute response or a chronic adaptation. In either case, exercise does help to burn more energy, but it probably isn't going to contribute quite as much as we may think. So it shouldn't be the number one priority when trying to induce a calorie deficit for weight loss. However, there is another way in which physical activity can influence the energy balance equation, and that is via appetite regulation. This research review aimed to explore the mechanisms regulating how much food we eat. They propose that exercise plays a role in regulating our energy intake. If you exercise very little, then there seems to be a dysregulation of energy intake versus expenditure, meaning your appetite tends to be greater relative to how much energy you burn. But as you become at least moderately active, your energy intake becomes regulated to a greater extent, meaning your appetite tends to increase proportionately with the amount of energy you burn. So overall, physical activity is still important for fat loss, just not as important as diet. Using total daily steps as a guide, we probably want to achieve at least a moderate step count to assist with expending a little more energy and helping to regulate our appetite, somewhere between 5 to 10,000 per day. For additional benefits, it is probably going to be helpful to increase this above 10,000 per day if it is viable. Then going beyond 15,000 per day might have some small additional benefits, but it probably isn't worth the additional time and effort required unless you habitually have a very high activity level. Our next priority for fat loss is another nutrition variable, and that is our total daily protein intake. It is well established that consuming a high daily protein intake is beneficial for muscle growth via resistance training and also to preserve muscle mass during weight loss. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of different protein intakes during a calorie deficit on body composition changes. 39 military personnel from the US Army performing their regular physical activity schedule were assigned to a 40% calorie restricted diet for 3 weeks. One group were assigned to consume the recommended dietary protein intake of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. The other group consumed double this amount, 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And the third group consumed triple the RDA at 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. After 3 weeks, all groups lost a significant amount of body weight. However, the low protein group lost a greater proportion of fat-free mass, meaning they lost a lower proportion of fat mass, while the moderate and high protein groups retained a greater amount of fat-free mass and therefore lost a greater proportion of fat mass. However, we should be aware that a high protein intake isn't a replacement for resistance training. Resistance training is going to have a greater effect on muscle retention than just consuming a high protein diet. And ideally, you would want to perform resistance training and consume a high protein intake for the best fat loss results. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of protein intake and/or resistance training on body composition changes during weight loss. 100 overweight or obese adults followed a diet designed to be 600 calories below their estimated energy needs for 10 weeks. One consuming a lower protein intake of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, one consuming a higher protein intake of 1.3 grams per kilogram per day, the third consuming a lower protein intake but also performing resistance training 3 times per week, and the last group consuming a higher protein intake plus performing resistance training 3 times per week. After 10 weeks, all groups lost significant body weight. The low and high protein intake groups approximately maintained all their fat-free mass. The group exercising saw a slight increase in fat-free mass, and therefore a greater proportion of fat loss. and the high protein plus exercise group saw an even greater increase in fat-free mass and therefore an even greater proportion of fat loss. So how much protein should we aim to consume? Well, essentially, higher protein intakes tend to be better for muscle growth or retention, but there seems to be diminishing returns. Once protein intake exceeds around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day, there likely isn't much additional benefit going higher than this. Furthermore, this relationship probably looks different based on biological sex and body fat. Females at a higher body fat likely require a lower relative protein intake, and males at a lower body fat likely see more benefit from a slightly higher relative protein intake. Check out the video in the description for more detail on how to individualize protein intake based on these factors. While a high protein diet is generally helpful for fat loss from a physiological perspective, a very high protein diet can potentially be harmful from a behavioral standpoint. In some cases, trying to consume a very high protein intake can make it more difficult to adhere to a calorie deficit, which is our #1 priority. This might be due to a few reasons, such as trying to target a very high protein intake might result in you eating more calories than you otherwise would just to hit a target. If you were to consume a very high protein intake and adhere to your calorie target, this means you will need to consume fewer fats and carbohydrates, which may make your diet less flexible and sustainable. You may also just not enjoy eating very high protein, low fat, and low carb foods all the time, making it less likely for you to stick to the diet. And lastly, high protein foods are generally the most expensive in our diet, which could make it less sustainable in some cases. The next factor on our hierarchy of importance for fat loss is sleep. Some may argue that sleep should be higher on the list of importance, and that might be true. However, there is simply not much evidence which directly looks at the effects of sleep on muscle growth and fat loss in a controlled setting. So it is hard to justify sleep being of greater importance until we have more clear data to support it. So what evidence do we have? Well, there are 2 studies I am aware of which explore this topic. The first looked at the effects of restricted sleep during a calorie deficit on body composition changes. 36 overweight or obese adults consumed a calorie intake of 95% of their predicted metabolic rate for 8 weeks. One group slept normally during the diet, which ended up being around 6.5 hours per night. The other group were instructed to reduce their total time in bed by 90 minutes from their habitual sleep habits for 5 days of the week, and then sleep as normal on the other 2 days. This group ended up sleeping for an average of 5.5 hours per night on the restricted sleep days and around 7.5 hours on the non-restricted days. After 8 weeks, both groups lost a similar amount of total body weight. And in both cases, the proportion of fat mass and lean mass that was lost was also similar. And the other study we have explored a similar concept. In this study, 10 overweight adults consumed a calorie intake of 90% of their predicted metabolic rate on 2 separate 14-day periods. On one occasion, they were permitted 8.5 hours in bed, and on the other occasion, they were only allowed 5.5 hours of time in bed with the goal of restricting sleep. It was found that after both interventions, total weight lost was similar. However, the participants lost a greater amount of fat-free mass during the restricted sleep condition compared with the normal sleep condition. This also meant that when sleeping longer, subjects experienced greater fat loss compared with when sleep was restricted. So overall, if sleep is restricted a little on some days, but you catch up on other days, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on fat loss. However, if sleep is chronically restricted, then it might result in a greater amount of lean mass loss, which would therefore result in less body fat loss. Sleep also plays an important indirect role in the fat loss process too, and this is its effects on exercise and diet behaviors. For example, this study explored the effects of sleep restriction on food intake. 12 healthy adults underwent 2 separate 14-day periods of controlled time in bed with unlimited access to food throughout the day. On one occasion, they were given 9 hours of bedtime, and on the other occasion, they were only given 4 hours of time in bed with the goal to restrict sleep. It was found that during the sleep restriction phase, subjects ate an average of about 250 calories more compared with when they were given more sleep. And in terms of exercise, this study compared the effects of sleep restriction on exercise performance and perceived fatigue. 10 females with at least 6 months lifting experience performed 4 resistance training sessions over a 9-day period on 2 separate occasions. On one occasion, they were given 8 or more hours in bed to sleep as normal. On the other occasion, they were restricted to only 5 hours in bed per night. It was found that total volume load per session was similar during both phases, indicating that lifting performance wasn't significantly inhibited. However, sleep restriction increased the subject's perceived exertion of each training session, shown in the orange, indicating that it took more effort to complete each workout. And subjects also reported a greater training distress score, which is a subjective rating of stress, fatigue, and depressive symptoms during the restricted sleep protocol. So in terms of diet and exercise behavior, restricted sleep is likely to have negative effects. It can decrease the likelihood of sticking to a calorie deficit and increase the perceived effort it takes to exercise, which are the 2 most important factors for fat loss. Next on our hierarchy of importance for fat loss is the rate at which we lose weight. While simply being in a calorie deficit over time is the most important factor for fat loss, the magnitude of the deficit also seems to influence body composition changes too. Eating in a greater calorie deficit will result in a faster rate of weight loss, while eating in a smaller calorie deficit will result in slower weight loss. So how does our rate of weight loss influence fat loss? This was explored in this study, which compared the effects of a faster versus slower rate of weight loss in elite athletes. 24 elite athletes from the Norwegian Olympic Sports Centre performed their regular sport training during their off-season, in addition to 4 resistance training sessions per week. Half the subjects were prescribed to lose weight at a slower rate, while the others aimed to lose weight at a faster rate. The slow weight loss group lost 4.2 kilograms in about 9 weeks, while the fast weight loss group lost the same amount of body weight in around 5 weeks. And protein intake was the same between groups at 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. It was found that although both groups lost the same amount of total body weight, the slow weight loss group resulted in a small gain in lean mass, while the fast weight loss caused a very slight decrease in lean mass. This meant that the slow weight loss group lost a little more fat mass, while the faster weight loss group lost a little less fat mass. Although both groups lost mostly fat since they were both performing resistance training and had a high protein intake. So although it isn't the most important consideration, you would probably want to avoid rapid weight loss if the goal is to retain as much muscle as possible. As a general rule, losing weight at a rate of no more than around 1% of body weight per week will likely increase the amount of muscle we can preserve and therefore increase the proportion of fat lost. Now we are moving on to the factors which don't seem to be very important for fat loss, the first of which is your carbohydrate and fat intake. In addition to protein, these macronutrients will make up your total calorie intake. If you were eating in a calorie deficit and you were getting a sufficient amount of protein per day, the exact ratio of carbohydrate versus fat doesn't seem to have much of an influence on body composition changes. For example, this study compared the effects of weight loss with different macronutrient profiles on body composition changes. 62 subjects with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease were assigned to one of 3 different weight loss diets for 12 weeks. These were either a low-carb, high-fat diet, a 5-2 diet, or individualized nutrition counseling, referred to as standard of care. As we can see, protein made up about 20% of total calories in each diet, but the other macronutrients differed. The low-carb diet had a much lower proportion of carbohydrate and much higher fat, while the other 2 diets consisted of about 40% of calories coming from both fat and carbohydrates. After 12 weeks, all groups lost weight, with the 5-2 and low-carb diets losing more weight. The proportion of abdominal adipose tissue reduced similarly in all groups, which was relative to the amount of weight that was lost. And thigh muscle volume, which was the only measure of muscle mass taken, reduced by a similar proportion in all groups too. There might be, however, a small advantage of consuming a higher carbohydrate diet for those performing lots of exercise. This systematic review aimed to assess the influence of carbohydrate intake on resistance training performance. Overall, it was found that carbohydrate intake doesn't seem to have a significant impact on lifting performance in most cases. Although performance during high volume lifting sessions may benefit a little from a higher carbohydrate diet. So if you were performing a high volume of resistance training, or lots of exercise in general, you might want to opt for a slightly higher carbohydrate and therefore lower fat diet to support exercise performance. This might indirectly influence fat loss by helping to preserve greater muscle mass via resistance training. As a general rule, you probably want to consume a minimum of around 0.5 grams per kilogram of fat per day for essential bodily functions. And you probably want to get at least around 1.5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per day to support exercise performance. Beyond these minimum levels, you can adjust the exact ratios of carbs and fats to suit your diet preferences and exercise levels. And the last factor on our list that is probably least important is the frequency, timing, and distribution of when we eat our meals throughout the day. If you were eating in a calorie deficit with sufficient protein, the number of meals you consume per day, and when these meals are consumed, has very little, if any, effect on fat loss in the majority of cases. For example, this study compared the effects of different meal frequencies during weight loss on body composition changes. 43 overweight or obese females were prescribed a diet containing 90% of their estimated calorie needs for 3 months. The diets consisted of 55 to 60% carbohydrates, 12 to 15% protein, and 25 to 30% fat. Half the subjects consumed this across 3 larger meals per day, while the others consumed this across 6 smaller meals per day. After 3 months, both groups lost a similar amount of total body weight, with similar proportions of fat mass and fat-free mass lost. So individuals can implement a meal frequency and timing protocol based on their personal preferences. You could eat fewer larger meals per day, or more frequent smaller meals, as long as you are able to adhere to a calorie deficit and consume a decent amount of protein. With all this information, let's establish some practical recommendations. The most important factor to achieve fat loss is calorie intake. You want to eat in a calorie deficit to lose weight over time. During the weight loss period, resistance training is going to be the most effective way to preserve muscle mass so that a greater proportion of the lost weight comes from fat. Resistance training to retain muscle mass should essentially look the same as if you were intending to build muscle mass. Next, we have general physical activity, which is best quantified as the total number of steps performed per day. Higher activity levels can help to burn a little more energy, but shouldn't be relied upon as the primary method of inducing a calorie deficit. Being physically active also helps to regulate hunger and satiety levels, which may help adherence to a calorie deficit. Next on the list is protein intake. Consuming more protein per day, in conjunction with resistance training, can increase the amount of muscle we preserve during weight loss. More protein generally seems to be better, but there is less additional benefit as protein intake becomes higher and higher. If possible, it would be beneficial to try and consume 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day or more if it is practically viable. The next factor on our list is sleep. Chronically restricted sleep might have a small detrimental effect on the proportion of muscle versus fat lost during a calorie deficit. However, the bigger concern is that restricted sleep seems to result in a higher calorie intake and decreases the likelihood or effort of exercise. Next on the list is our rate of weight loss. Losing weight at a faster rate tends to result in a little more muscle being lost in the process, while losing weight at a slower rate tends to be a little better for muscle preservation. As a general rule, you want to try and lose weight at a rate of no more than around 1% of body weight per week. Next on the list is carbohydrate and fat intake. If you are adhering to a calorie deficit and consuming sufficient protein, the exact amount of carbohydrates and fat you consume doesn't seem to have much of an impact on fat loss. A minimum of 0.5 grams per kilogram per day of fat is recommended to support essential functions, and a minimum of around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrates are recommended to support exercise performance. Once these minimums are met, you can decide to consume a slightly higher carb or higher fat diet based on personal preference. And lastly, we have meal frequency, timing, and distribution. With calories and macros equated, the exact number of meals you consume per day and the timing of these meals doesn't seem to have much, if any, influence on fat loss. Therefore, how many meals you eat per day and when you eat these meals can be adjusted based on personal preference. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.